Hello, and welcome back to the Cabby Forge. This week I was putting together some hired guns and mercenary types for a bit of Necromunda, and rather handily Wargames Atlantic had started doing these digital releases, and they do these pretty post-apocalyptic raider types. Stylistically, they're about halfway between Caesar's Legion and the NCR from Fallout New Vegas. And to start with, grabbed some regular bases and trimmed down the nubbins on the end. Then using some superglue to attach all the torso and legs to the bases. Once those had fully cured, I went around attaching the arms. And there was a nice assortment of weapons included. You have melee weapons, kind of riot shield type things, shotguns, modern-y looking weapons, as well as some more sci-fi bits. So you can cover a real variety of settings if you wanted to with these. The main problem with working with resin instead of plastic with a kit like this is that you do suffer with the joints. If they don't quite fit, you can't as easily just trim a bit away or melt it with a plastic glue. You're basically stuck with the resin as it came out the printer and a little bit of filing. But I'm happy to say I didn't have any real issue with these parts. Everything fit together quite well. And all the pre-supports worked as intended. To put some texture on the bases, I used Vallejo base texture and varied the consistency while I applied it on the base with the sculpting tool. Then, to add some more texture, I took some tiny gravel rocks from Javis and sprinkled them over the top of the base before pushing them down with the sculpting tool. Then, using some select smaller aquarium rocks, push one into every other base. These four then joined two test prototypes I had and hadn't got around to finishing yet. I brought them all together with a coat of Vallejo black surface primer, applied using a brush. This was followed by a dark brown base coat all over the model and the base. And I'm not going to do a step-by-step how to paint, because I think there's a lot better painting YouTubers out there. But I will talk a bit about the thoughts I had behind the painting process. By using a dark brown as the undercoat and using it on the base as well, sort of tie the colour of the environment and the characters together, so that they will kind of appear to be in the same palette and in the same world. And with a dark metallic paint, picked out the shields and the weaponry, as well as the armour plating that they have, which would then get covered a lot by rust and dirt later on. The models themselves have an eclectic mishmash of different armour, and most of them have different styles of shoulder pads or breastplates or helmets. To reflect this in the colour scheme, I went for a mismatched but also similar colour scheme. So with a light green and a tan colour, alternated between the tunic and the trousers, so that they would all match, but not necessarily in the same order. But so they didn't look too uniform, I did go in with a more reddish brown and highlighted the trousers and tunic on 2 of them. I was in 2 minds about what colour to paint the flesh, whether to go for a very sunburnt looking weathered appearance or to go for an overly pale and irradiated flesh tone. But to start with, just went in with a mid-tan and gave a base layer of paint down. I used a mid-brown for the leather detailing, just so it would stand out against the tan colour of the tunic. This also picked out the details on the gas mask, as well as the pouch ears and sacks that they have. Moving back to the skin tone, I decided to go for the sickly, kind of irradiated look, and with a pale green again, went in and gave a slightly diluted highlight over the flesh. Then to give a bit of narrative, using a red and a green, I picked out a few armour plates, so they would stand out amongst the brown and the tan colours, and it would appear that they'd taken their armour from different places and people. By applying over a metallic colour, it does appear a bit more worn, and ties back in to the sort of dilapidated equipment they have. I tried to avoid picking consecutive plates, and picking the smaller of the armour, so they would still have the metallic colour for the majority. Where this guy has a lovely collection of pustules and boils on one side of his head, I made sure to give these a bright highlight of green, so he has some kind of radioactive growth attached to his head. Moving into more kind of subtle detailing stage, I took a brush with some metallic paint and feathered the edges on any of the painted armour plates, and it gives a very subtle effect where they're scratched on the edges and more likely to have wear and tear. So the bolts on the helmet and the edges of the armour just get a slight shine to them. For the hair, I gave an extra bright highlight along the base edge, near his neck, and then used a watered down black paint along his roots, so you get a nice contrast where maybe his roots are growing out and he'd once bleached his hair. Using the same diluted black paint, I applied a patina over all the dark metallics, as well as on some of the cloth, where I felt it needed a bit more detail. And the advantage of using a paint that's watered down instead of an ink is it dries to a matte finish as opposed to a glossy one, and you have a bit more control over where you put the shadow. Keeping in the same yellowy tan palette, I picked out a few of the grenades that were attached to the bandoliers, and using the same bright green I'd used for the pustules, so they'd tie together, I went in and painted the lenses on the helmets. Next I moved on to some final detailing, and a little bit of weathering. To start with, I wanted to apply some rust, so using dark rust from AK Interactive, and I watered that down until it was very diluted, and applied it into the recesses of the armour, as well as the weapons. By watering it down, it will naturally seek the edges, and build up where rust is more likely to do so. It's also a very subtle effect, so you might have to go in and do it 2 or 3 times, depending on how heavy you want the rust to go. You can also mix in some yellow or red, or even green and blue, if you want to have a bit more of a interesting rust colour. To give the guns a bit more of a heat warped effect, I used some Vallejo colour shifting paint, and applied it over the barrel and the tip of most of the guns, as well as the machete. This also has a very subtle effect, and the more you layer up, the more prevalent it will be, and I enhanced this by adding a tiny dab of black paint on the barrel where there's some muzzle burn. The final step was to give some highlights on the base, as well as putting some build-up of dust and dirt on the models themselves. So with a large soft brush, and fairly diluted tan paint, going around and hitting the base as well as the lower 50% of the model where they would have trailed dirt and kicked up sand on them. And this also blends them quite nicely into the bases. With that, I was happy with them. And there we have a group of 6 hired guns for a variety of game systems. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Catch you next time.